You know, when we talk about history, we think in terms of Columbus discovering America. If you're like I was when I was a little kid growing up, why, Columbus discovered America, and we have a holiday on October the 12th every year that we celebrate the discovery of America. One day, I was traveling with my wife in Illinois, and she looked over at me and she said, well, would you like to visit one of the pyramids here in Illinois? And I said, pyramids? And she said, yes, there's about 7 or 8 of them here, and not far from here, just a few miles, is one of those big pyramids. And I said, well, who built it? And she said, well, nobody seems to know. And I said, well, how big is it? And she said, well, it's several hundred feet high, and it covers several acres. It's as big as the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And I was amazed. I'd never heard of such a thing. I said, here in Illinois, there's a pyramid? And she said, yes, not just 1, but 7 or 8. And I said, yeah, I got to see this. And so we drove off the main highway, and we drove a little while, and pretty soon here out in the middle of the flat lands of Illinois, rising on the horizon was this big hill. We drove over to the big hill. It was covered by brush and trees, and we went into the park. It's a state park. And paid our fee, and we walked in. I stood at the bottom of it, and I looked at this, and I said, why is it that I have been educated in America, went to the public school system, and here is a monument 400 feet high, sitting in the middle of a cornfield, covering about 15 or 20 acres of ground, a humongous mound of earth. And I never heard about it. And I'm 42 years old. Never heard about it. Well, it's not the only thing that I haven't heard about. It's not the only thing that you probably hadn't heard about. But have you ever heard about Egyptian hieroglyphics here in America? Have you heard about any monuments, writings, or coins found here in America that predate Columbus? How about Irish Ogham writing, Phoenician coins, Roman pottery, Noah's burial mounds found in West Virginia, Georgia, Michigan, Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Colorado, just to name a few places where these sites and these discoveries have been found. And then ask yourself, what did you hear when you went to school, when you went to college? Maybe you're an archaeologist or an anthropologist. Did you ever hear about America BC? Well, we've heard about the Indians, and we ascribe these monuments and these strange phenomena to these Indians who deny them. And when you ask the Indians of Illinois, did you or your people or any history in the past build these pyramids out here? And they'll tell you, nope, we didn't build them. Do you know who did? And they'll say, nope, we don't know who did. We don't know who built them. We didn't, but there they are. And they are totally ignored in the literature. I mean ignored, like they never existed. It's not the first time I've ever seen this kind of hiding the truth. We see it in politics, we see it in economics, we see it in medicine. And the truth is, we find it in science also. For instance, in March of 1493, the Catholic Church was presented with an unforeseen problem. Christopher Columbus had just landed in Lisbon after an 8-month voyage that was to have taken him to the Indies, but instead of going to the Indies, it had led him to discover a new world. And the difficulty now confronting the prelates of the Catholic Church was that he had returned with passengers, American Indians, who had all of the appearance of being human beings. But how could their existence be accounted for? The biblical account of creation described 3 continents, each occupied by the seed of 3 sons, the 3 sons of Noah who survived the flood, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Columbus seems already to have been aware of the impending theological problem, because in a letter dated February 15th, 1493, written at the Canary Islands, he assured King Ferdinand that the people that he found were no monsters, but on the contrary were very well formed. Neither were they Negroes, And when he put ashore in Lisbon on March 6th, his journal records, many people came to see the Indians, and it was a great marvel. As the second and third and later voyages produced ever-mounting evidence of large numbers of man-like creatures inhabiting the Americas, a cold wind of skepticism began to blow through the monasteries to ruffle the equanimity of those who so boldly preached the absolute truth of Genesis. And for a time, Rome disregarded the matter, as Pope Alexander VI was otherwise engaged, save only when he found time to draw a line of demarcation between the Spanish and the Portuguese portions of the New World. But in 1512, a new pope summoned the Fifth Lateran Council and issued an official declaration certifying that American Indians are true descendants of Adam and Eve, and hence they are human beings. The failure of the Bible to account for them and to account for their continent was made good by the inference that American Indians are the descendants of Babylonians expelled from the Old World on account of sins of their ancestors. Now, backed by this new authority, it was now safe for speculative churchmen to ponder the route from the Garden of Eden to America. After considering the possibilities that Noah's Ark might have added an American port of call to her scheduled sailing plan, or that angels might have transported people across the ocean, holding them by the hair of the head, like to the prophet Habakkuk, a Spanish thinker, Jose de Acosta dismissed both propositions in favor of transportation by shipwreck and accidental tempest of the weather. Now, the inquiry was now taken up by others, and by the 17th century, both Protestant and Catholic churchmen were agreed that Asia must have been the original homeland of the American Indian forefathers, because only the rude Tartars, above all nations on earth, resemble the inhabitants of America in respect of their gross ignorance of letters and of the arts, their idolatry, and above all, their incivility. Alas, for Pocahontas, there was no Fenimore Cooper on hand to defend the Six Nations, no Deerslayer yet to win hearts or minds for the dwellers in the wilderness. One dissident, Cotton Mather in Boston, in the course of a long series of extraordinary letters to the Royal Society of London, drew attention to the existence in Connecticut of a tribe of Indians which practiced circumcision, thereby showing he thought that the American Indians should be considered as the lost tribes of Israel. Voltaire, on the other hand, considered that the American Indians had arisen de novo in America by whatever mechanism had similarly caused human beings to appear upon the face of the earth in the other continents. By 1811, such scientists as Humboldt recognized the similarities between some American tribes and those of the Mongol race, and he postulated that the American Indians are descended from a mingling of ancient Americans and later in-wanderers from Asia. Later still, most of the anthropologists came to agree that all American Indians are descended from ancestors that entered the Americas by way of the Bering Strait, and that no European came to America before Leif Erikson or Columbus. Now, in recent years, one lone voice has protested this kind of oversimplification, that of Harold Sterling Gladwin. And in his various writings, Gladwin has repeatedly drawn attention to cultural features and material objects, particularly pottery, that show that American tribes must have had relatively recent contacts with the Old World of Europe and the Middle East, especially with the Mediterranean and with the Orient. The nature of the various art styles to which he drew attention is such as to point to direct voyages between the Old World and the Americas as late as classical times, about 2,000 years ago, or about the time of Christ. Gladwin's views have, until very recently, been strictly ruled out, anathema, and they have been excluded from the college curricula. Now, fortunately, this exclusionist attitude is now considerably ameliorated. His writings, once forbidden reading in colleges and universities in America, have now been and have become prescribed texts at places such as Harvard. Now, for generations, the archaeological world has been beset by the notion that only the navigational techniques introduced in Europe in the 15th century made it possible for Europeans to cross the Atlantic, although some grudging acquiescence is conceded to those who point to the evidence of the sagas, showing that the Viking crossings by way of Greenland, which occurred before Columbus, have been well documented. So at the time when Gladwin issued Men Out of Asia in 1947, he too felt compelled to bring the Mediterranean influence to the Americas by way of an Asian and or Indonesian land-hopping route. The vectors being supposedly the ships of the fleet of Menarchus, left stranded in Asia after the death of Alexander the Great. Well, in recent years, new discoveries in the Pacific caves have begun to lend much support to this facet of Gladwin's theories, but at the same time, the newer evidence also shows very clearly that the Atlantic was by no means the great barrier that earlier thinkers had supposed. So what, it is reasonable to ask then, is this newer evidence? Well, in fact, it is not new in and of and by itself, because it has lain intact for more than 2,000 years. All that is new is our ability to read the inscriptions concerned, because indeed they are written, and in some sense documents, carefully engraved on the bedrock of America, on temple lintels, and on the gravestones of kings and chiefs. And they speak to us of a long-forgotten age of exploration and of colonization, which is the subject of this book. When American archaeologists first began to send me inscriptions for decipherment and translation, I was astonished to learn that such documents existed here in America. All of my earlier work had been on ancient tablets and cave inscriptions of the Old World, records of the Sea Peoples of the Bronze Age and early Iron Age some 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. But what I now began to receive from unimpeachable sources here in North America were essentially the same types of documents, engraved in stone, and they were either excavated from some archaeological site, or they were recorded from cliff faces or photographed on massive rocks discovered by the early colonists. And I'd never seen such materials mentioned or illustrated in any books on archaeology of the Americas, and indeed I was totally oblivious to their existence. How is it, I asked my friend and colleague Professor George Carter of Texas, that you are sending me all of these materials? Has no one studied them before? Well, his answer was, for 75 years I have been knocking on the study doors of professors of Greek and Latin. And each time I have been told that the objects that I had in my hand look like writing, but that it is not Greek, and that it is not Latin, nor is it any script known to my consultants. So I emerged no wiser than before. Now, the very manner in which George Carter and I were brought together is in itself instructive, because it illustrates both the difficulties now besetting communication between men working in different disciplines and the strengths of those more liberal institutions of learning that encourage their faculty to cross the lines that divide the disciplines. Carter was trained as an archaeologist at the University of California at Berkeley, but he has chosen to devote much of his life to the study of the geographical distribution of man and his domesticated plants and animals. Through his research at Johns Hopkins and then later at Texas A&M, his work became well known to biologists at Harvard, especially to botanists working on the evolution and distribution of plants cultivated by man around the world. Now, I, for my part, though a marine biologist, have spent much of my life studying the ancient voyages of people who left inscriptions on remote islands, which, of course, could only have been approached by sea. As a marine biologist, I felt obliged to examine this evidence because it would have a bearing on how the dispersal of man, plants, and animals might be influenced by ocean currents and winds. So the decipherment of these ancient inscriptions, the art of epigraphy, became my second specialty. And it was through my fellow biologists at Harvard that Carter and I were introduced to each other's work. I learned that he had amassed a fine collection of American inscriptions in the hope that their eventual decipherment might explain or illuminate his own researches, and he, for his part, now found a man who claimed to recognize the languages on his tablets. We soon found that the emerging information is consistent with our other independent investigations, and so the seal was set on a collaboration that proved very, very rewarding. When word began to appear in linguistic and archaeological periodicals of this joint effort, other archaeologists and some linguists contacted us. A flow of information now began that soon swelled to proportions far beyond anything that either George Carter or I had dreamed of. The Epigraphic Society was established, and we began to publish our findings, as well as those of others, in a form readily available to other interested people, both professional and amateur. So began the busiest and most productive period of my life, an exciting journey through space and time, bringing new friendships in a score of countries. From the information that we gleaned from the first American tablets to be deciphered, we gained important hints as to where more inscriptions might be expected to be found. So I deserted my study table and the world of dictionaries for a while to spend a wonderful summer crisscrossing the hills and valleys of the New England countryside, rejoicing whenever a terrace or ridge top yielded yet another inscribed stone. My field companions and I became deeply aware of the presence all around us of traces of a vanished civilization that had once flourished here in America. Of these New England excursions, I was most often accompanied by John Williams, a young schoolteacher from Connecticut, who soon made himself expert in detecting the presence of inscribed rocks beneath the soil and later carried out many exploratory trips on his own. Between the two of us, we covered some 11,000 miles on the roads and hundreds of miles on foot, clambering up hillsides or more often pushing through the woodlands that once more occupy much of the back country of New England. We were often joined by my wife Renee, who occasionally made discoveries of her own. Another frequent companion was Peter J. Garfall, joined later by Joseph D. Germano, who, whenever they would spare the time, would bring their cameras to record these finds. And when the suggestion was made at one stage in one of the newspapers that we might be forging the inscriptions, it became increasingly necessary to have cameras as well as witnesses on hand to record the thick coat of lichens covering these inscriptions before they were brushed clean for making a plaster cast. Other companions from time to time were our archaeologist friends and local residents who sometimes could lead us directly to a site known to them. Now, these were long days from dawn until near midnight, but we managed to bring back to Boston a very fine series of aluminum foil impressions from which casts could be prepared on days when the weather forbade this type of field work. The alphabets and languages that we found on American inscriptions are fully discussed later in this book. But the representative examples on pages 21 and 22 show how the American colonists or visitors wrote in the first millennium BC. So let's note the similarity to corresponding examples from Europe. Now, while John Williams and I roamed the New England outback country for Celtic inscriptions, another colleague was making notable finds in the Midwest and the Southwest. This was Gloria Farley, an intrepid explorer of the cliffs and caves that border the banks of the Arkansas and the Cimarron rivers and their tributaries. Armed with camera and snakebite anti-venom, rubber latex for making impressions, and a ladder, Gloria Farley systematically assembled a remarkable series of records of visits and settlements by European voyagers who had ascended the Mississippi River and then turned west to follow the Arkansas River, eventually to reach the Cimarron River along the border between Oklahoma and Colorado. Her discoveries showed that some Celts had followed this southern route and that Libyans and Punic-speaking Iberians and even one Basque king had ventured into the heartland of the continent centuries before Christ. Gloria Farley will be remembered for these fine contributions to our national archives, a bright example of grit and determination in the face of discouragement on the part of those who might have helped her. On account of the skepticism and even opposition to our work that we experienced at first from some of the professional archaeologists, nearly all of the inscriptions that we first examined were ones that we discovered ourselves, John Williams and Gloria Farley being the leading explorers. Later, when our work became better understood, we began to receive valuable help from museum curators and some universities or other institutions where mysterious inscribed stones or tablets had been deposited by finders long ago. We received no financial support from any scientific fund, but through the generosity and faith of Ruth K. Hanner, the Epigraphic Society has been able to establish its own modest fund, and this, supplemented by our family budgets, has financed our travel expenses and the cost of latex and other materials needed for making copies of inscriptions that we have found cut in the rock. Those who have participated in this exploration include Malcolm Pearson, a gifted photographer who has recorded inscriptions for many years and who originally led William Goodwin to the ruins at Mystery Hill. James Whittall, architect, archaeologist, a Harvard graduate, and authority on the megalithic structures of Portugal, Spain, and of New England. Robert Stone, the curator and present owner of the Mystery Hill site in New Hampshire, which he has protected and opened to the public, and who first demonstrated the existence of an ancient astronomical observatory among the ruins in an American setting. Elizabeth Sincirbo of Vermont, who perceived the antiquity of the supposed colonial root cellars and encouraged a young amateur astronomer, Byron Dix, to investigate what he later discovered to be calendar sites in that state. These, and others to be named in later pages, were the colleagues who now became our closest collaborators and who, like us, had to endure much opposition. But the work was its own reward, and all of us who took part in this research agree that we lived in exciting days, and we loved every minute of them. And yet these treasures are endangered. Christopher McIntosh, an English investigator, has given an account of the ever-increasing threat of destruction of ancient sites as a result of modern highway construction and like developments. He called his 1971 report "The Race to Save Britain's Past." And it often seemed to us in Vermont that we, too, are racing against time, with the added threat of vandalism. And as the months went by, I perceived a change in the attitude of my field collaborators, who seemed to become imbued with a new zest, determined to save these relics, come what may. Well, boys and girls, that's Chapter 2 of America BC. It's the introduction to a wild new concept. That concept is that ancient explorers from the Middle East, the Far East, and Europe came to America by way of the Atlantic Ocean, sailed across the ocean, and had ports of call, colonies, and were digging tin, copper, and iron ore out of the Americas, loading it on ships and hauling it back to their home ports of call. Sounds preposterous that this was going on in the days of David and Solomon, the kings of Israel, of the ancient Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks. But yes, boys and girls, it's true. There was an America BC. All right, America BC is written by Barry Fell. Barry Fell is a professor, he's dead now, at Harvard University. And as you see here, looking at the monuments, the America's oldest archives, is an 18-chapter presentation published back in 1989. It was first copyrighted in 1976, last published in 1989 by Barry Phil. You can probably get a copy at Barnes & Noble. It's pretty common today. I think the book is still in print. If you can't get it there, I'm sure that any used bookstore hooked up to the computer network can find a copy for you. It's fascinating reading. I picked up a copy because of a meeting that I had with one of his collaborators, a lady by the name of Gloria Farley. She died just recently. Now, both of these people have been doing this for 50 years. So go back 50 years and starting around 1955 or 60 or 65 or 70. These people were out in the fields. They were out in Arkansas looking at burial mounds. They were going up and down the Arkansas River looking at Hebrew and Irish Ogham writing and trying to decipher it, trying to figure out, well, where'd this come from? So they'd go to the Indian tribes and they'd say, well, now let's see, you Navajo Indians live here, or you Cherokee Indians lived here. Do you know anything about that? And the Indians would say, well, no, we didn't do that. That's not a part of our culture. But there it is. Well, if the Indians didn't put it there, then somebody else obviously did. As I began today's program, I said my wife showed me a pyramid. Now, I'm going to describe this for most of you people have probably never heard of these dirt mounds. They call them the mounds out in the Midwest. They're just mounds of dirt. You know, to most people, they're just mounds of dirt. Let me describe it. I was down in Mexico City, and I went out to the ancient pyramids. There's two of them out there. One's called the Pyramid of the Moon, and the other was called the Pyramid of the Sun. And I remember as a young man looking at that Pyramid of the Sun, I said, oh my God, these people here in Central America, when they built that pyramid, one of two things had to have occurred. Number one, the Egyptians came over here and saw that pyramid and went back and built some just like it. Or these Indians went over to Egypt and saw those pyramids and came back here and built one just like it. Or somebody has been to both places and then brought the technology and the design and built it over here or over there. There had to have been contact between the Aztecs and the Incas and so on in order for there to be, in this new world, monuments built on the same architectural design or plan as those in the old world. Now, we don't say that the people of Egypt came from Mexico. We say that the people of Mexico somehow got there from Europe or the Middle East. And I don't know which is which, but I presume that the human race migrated out of the Middle East and migrated all over the world. And so, of course, the story that I was told when I went to school was that Christopher Columbus was the first man to sail from Europe to the New World. And when he got here, he found these people, which then devolved upon a conversation as to how these people got here. And so the logical conclusion was that since these people did not have an advanced merchant marine, that they weren't sailing around. They had canoes, but they didn't have ships that could cross the Atlantic. Then they must have come from Asia. And when they saw these people, the Western Indians, and they saw that they had Mongol features, they said, they came from Asia. Therefore, they must have crossed the Bering Straits, which is only about 50 or 75 miles. They could make it across there in canoes because we know today that the Eskimos cross from Alaska to Siberia and from Siberia to Alaska. And then somebody came up with this ancient land bridge to fit in with the theory of evolution, and presto, we have the modality by which man got to the New World. That's what I was taught in school. That's what I learned. Now I sit down and I read this book by Barry Phil, and I feel like a dunderhead, like a fool. These people that came over here and built those pyramids down there in Central America had to have gotten that idea from somewhere. Now, what did they do? Go back across the land bridge for thousands of years and go down to Egypt and then come up across the land bridge? If that was the case, how come nobody ever wrote about it? How come we don't see that described by the Egyptians? Hey, we went up across the land bridge, went down to Central America or wherever they wanted to call it or whatever name they hung on it and built a pyramid. No, there's something more to the story. Something is bigger and better than what we've been told in our public school system. All right, we're talking about America BC. In the last program, I pointed out to you that there are more than 3,000 sites here in the United States of America that we have discovered, that we have found monuments, writings, coins, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Irish Ogham writing, Phoenician coins, Roman pottery, Norse burial mounds, and they've been found in numerous states. Not something that you found, say, in New York State or up in Massachusetts, but they've been found all over the United States. From New Mexico to West Virginia, from New Hampshire and Vermont to Georgia, Michigan, southern Canada, all over Central and South America, Brazil. In fact, Brazil, the word Brazil is a Hebrew word that means iron land. King Solomon had trading ships bringing iron ore into Elath in southern Israel. They found a blast furnace down there, the remnants, an ancient remnant of an oxygen-fired blast furnace, something that we didn't discover until nearly the 20th century here in the United States. Now, this ancient technology that we are discovering, I'm going to give you a couple of more examples. For instance, off of Bimini, there is a city under 60 feet of water, streets fully laid out, stone buildings built. It should be pretty obvious that whoever built that city and whenever it was built, it wasn't built when there was 60 feet of water there. It had to have been built at a time when that water wasn't there, which means that the ocean level had to be down 60 feet or that portion of the crust sank 60 feet. Well, it could be one or the others, but I just wanted to point out, here's this ancient city here in the Americas, 60 feet underwater. Down in Peru, there is a number of peculiar sights. Monkeys and spiders and other animals. I mean, when you're down here on the ground looking at these piles of rock, that when you get up in the air with an airplane, you can look down on it and see that it's a monkey, it's a spider, but you can't see it from the ground. Who built that and why? Who did it and when, and what was the purpose? There are walls. One wall down in Peru has a stone in it. 50 tons is the estimated weight. It's an irregular stone. It isn't square. It isn't rectangular. It's an odd-shaped stone. It's just like a rock coming out of the river. And then with that rock, all the rocks around it are cut to fit it. That technology is not available in the world today, and as I speak in the year 2007, we cannot duplicate that wall today. We don't have the technology for it. The Great Pyramid of Giza, Egypt, is plus or minus a half an inch on its four corners. We couldn't measure it until 1964 with laser transit to determine how square it was. We knew it was built pretty accurately. I mean, we measured it with tape measures. But a tape measure over 14 acres isn't that accurate. So, with a laser transit, though, you can. And then we found out there are expansion joints. Who came up with the idea that heat expands stone and that cold contracts it, and that you would need expansion joints in a monument or in a building that large, and without it the stones would crack? Well, whoever built it knew it, and whoever built it had at least the technology of a laser transit of 1964. And there's one more here I wanted to point out to you. It's called metal workers. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 22, there is a report here of a story. Listen to this. It says, Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. Now, here's Genesis 4, shortly after the Garden of Eden. And these people are artificers in brass and iron. Now, when you went to school, did you hear about the Iron Age, the Copper Age, the Stone Age? Did you hear about that? And did you hear about billions and billions of years? That's what I heard when I went to school. Did you hear about Columbus discovering America? And did you hear anything about those 7 or 8 pyramids out in Illinois? Did you hear about 3,000 archaeological sites in the United States with Egyptian hieroglyphics in them? Or with Irish Ogham, Roman pottery, Norse burial mounds? Did you hear about any of that? You know, our government and our public institutions, and when I say public institutions, I mean our corporations like General Motors, public institutions like our universities and colleges,
You know, the public institutions like our libraries, they lie to us a lot. Yes, our government and public institutions, they lie to us continually and constantly. They lie about economics. They lie about politics. They lie about war. How many lies have we been told over the past 4 years about the Iraq war? And that's by our president. Now, our congressmen and our senators, they stand up in the halls of our public institutions and reiterate the lies of our president that we now know are lies, and we know that they are lies because now we know that the president knew, and those senators and representatives knew or should have known that what they were doing at the time they did it was, in fact, wrong and a damn lie. I say damn lie because that's the way Mark Twain put it. He said there are lies, then there are damn lies, and then there's statistics. And that takes us to the realm of science. They lie about economics, politics, war, the budget, diet, food, science, evolution, and they lie about archaeology. And that's the subject matter of this week's program. This takes us to a book called America BC. A guy that wrote it is a Harvard professor, like Immanuel Velikovsky. He's a contrarian, a contrary guy. Well, they call those guys an iconoclast. A guy who stands up and says, yeah, I heard about Columbus, but it's BS. It's BS. And most of you people know what BS is. Besides Bachelor of Science, it's BS. And in the early 1970s, a group of us, this is Barry Fell speaking now in the epilogue, written in 1989. Now, he wrote this in 1989, nearly 20 years ago. He said, in the early 1970s, a group of us who were interested in ancient scripts used to meet occasionally at Harvard University to discuss the decipherment of what we believed to be ancient inscriptions. Out of these beginnings came the Epigraphic Society, formally inaugurated in 1974. And once our publications began to appear, the membership grew until now there are a dozen chapters in the United States and overseas. In this epilogue, some of the more interesting results of the Society's work are here presented. So I'm going to pause right here and make my little mark in the margin. I like to read a book by first starting off with the table of contents, and then I go to the last chapter. In this case, it's the epilogue, so that I can get the answer. So we'll start with the answer to the riddle. How's that? And in the epilogue, he starts off by saying, in this epilogue, some of the more interesting results of the Society's work are presented, because this book, is about 300 pages. It's 300 and some odd pages, 350 pages. Well documented and footnoted. Furthermore, they've got the photographs and plates in here of the original sites, where they took the pictures before they scraped off the lichens and the moss. That's to confound the skeptics who say that, well, it was a fake, that they made it themselves in the laboratory, took it out into the woods, and then said, look what we found. No, these are monuments that are humongous in sight, that weigh 30 tons. I saw one that Gloria Farley found over near Heavenly, Oklahoma, where she lived. And it's a huge rock. Hell, that thing must weigh 25, 30, 40 tons. It's all that a 10-wheel dump truck could haul, maybe even an 18-wheeler. And it's got this Ogham writing on it, and it's down in a little gully. And it's a state park. The state of Oklahoma is a state park. I never heard anything about it. I never read anything about that in any archaeological publications here in the United States. There is a wall of silence about these stories, about these archaeological finds of America BC, and there's a logical reason behind it. So let me share it with you. A lot of times people ask me questions like, why would the government do that? See, they can't believe it, number one, and so they come back in defense of the government because of their ignorance. See, all of us feel real bad when we find out we've been deceived, lied to. And so we have this belief system, and then when somebody challenges it, like Barry Fell, or somebody comes along and challenges FDR, but why would he do that? See? Well, there's a motivation behind it. The president lies to us about the war in Iraq for population or people control. That's the purpose behind it. They're in a program to create a one-world government like we had around the Tower of Babel. And the normal people of the world, the most of the people, the majority of the people, they don't want that. And so a minority of people have to enter into a conspiracy together to bring it to pass. The average American didn't want to go to war in 1938, so Franklin Roosevelt had to engineer foreign policy and the processes that work around us in international geopolitics to get the Japanese to attack us. Then we could stand up in righteous indignation and say, look what those nips did, and now we have to go to war. And the Japanese were actually responding to a 1937 policy in which the United States, along with Holland and a couple other countries in Europe, placed an embargo upon oil being exported from Indonesia to Japan. What would you think if a group of countries, let's say Russia, China, and Iran, got together and formed an embargo against the import of Middle East oil to the United States? I can assure you that war would be inevitable, and probably tomorrow morning. Certainly within 90 days. It's just an inevitable result. So when I heard about that, and of course I didn't hear about that in public school, I got that from the underground press. And when I saw that, I said, well, I'm not surprised that the Japanese attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor. I'm amazed that they waited 5 years. What took so long? It was an act of war when President Roosevelt did it in 1937. Why would they wait 5 years? Now, when we get over here to this epilogue in America BC, the question arises, why would the archaeological world, the scientific world, want to hide these Egyptian hieroglyphics found in West Virginia? They want to hide them because it doesn't fit with the political agenda. It doesn't fit with the scientific agenda. It doesn't fit with evolution. Evolution is what we've been taught in this country. The Bible has been ridiculed and impugned and taken out of our public schools because it's unscientific. Okay. Boys and girls, just what in the hell is scientific about hiding Egyptian hieroglyphics, Irish Ogham writing, and Phoenician coins found in burial sites in at least 9 states in America? Boys and girls, there isn't anything scientific about it. It is the antithesis of science. And that's just the god-awful bald truth of the matter. They're liars, frauds, and charlatans. Nothing more and nothing less. Now, occasionally, we get a little glimpse of reality from an insider. Now, this guy, Barry Fell, is one of the insiders. See, he's an archaeologist. He's a college professor. He's from Harvard. Harvard, as they say up in the Massachusetts area. Harvard. And so, he's somebody that's got some credentials. Now, he went about this, very, very slow and very, very cautiously. Having seen what happened to Emanuel Velikovsky, he didn't want to lose his job, and so, he kind of tiptoes around the tulips and tiptoes around the edges over here. He published this book back in 1976. Today, it is common knowledge. What he has reported in his book, America BC, is common knowledge. It's not accepted because it's not politically correct. You carpenters, plumbers, electricians, and longshoremen are not going to hear this anyplace else. You're not going to get it in your public schools, and your children are not going to hear this in their public schools. They're going to hear about laying the neighbor girl in the back seat of their Chevy or something, but they're not going to hear about America BC, because that would lead you to the Bible and Scripture. Now, I read to you this scripture a little earlier here about Genesis chapter 4, that they were artificers in brass and iron. Think about this for a second. When Columbus discovered America, they were casting cannon in sand. There were no turret lathes. There were no artificers in brass and iron in Columbus's time. They were not metal workers. They could cast cannon in sand. They could make spears, spear tips, and swords. But they could not make engines. They were not metallurgists. Now, here we have reported in ancient times, right after the Garden of Eden, artificers in brass and iron. Now just take a look at the history of the world from Columbus to today. We went from casting cannon in sand to being able to make sheet steel to make ships, iron ships that float in the water. We learned how to make rivets and bore holes in steel. We learned how to make steel from iron. We have learned in 500 years how to make plates of steel by adding other elements to make them harder. We've learned how to make aluminum, and we've learned how to make brass from copper. We've learned how to use other base metals and make mixtures of metals in order to become artificers in brass and iron. We now have turret lathes and metalworking machines, and we can make automobiles and engines and airplanes, and we have a technology that can take us to the moon. Or so they tell us. Well, boys and girls, if we can do that in 500 years, I want to remind you that from the Garden of Eden to the flood was 1,656 years. That's 3 times longer. Now, would you logically believe then, just, as an average Joe Six-Pack, why then were these people who are described in the Bible as already being artificers in brass and iron? They had metallurgical technology, and this guy was an instructor of metallurgy. Why would you expect that those people then, on the other side of the flood, would have a technology any less advanced than we have in the world today, when they had 3 times longer to develop it than we've had from Columbus to the present time? Now, when you add to that a couple of other factors, let's take a look at the British Museum and the Cairo Museum. They both have batteries in those museums that they have dug out of archaeological digs. Batteries, boys and girls. Batteries. Electricity. In ancient times, they had batteries, which tells us they had electricity. What were they using it for? Now, the other day, somebody wrote a letter in here, and I'll comment on this letter and probably do a series of programs on it, but he asked the question, he said, if Jesus existed, notice the words, if Jesus existed, not when, but if, why don't we have more monuments? Why don't we have more secular records, from Josephus or from the Romans or from the Greeks or somebody else? I mean, a guy that feeds 5,000 people surely should have been written up in the local newspaper of his day. He did it 3 times. A guy that walks on water and raises people from the dead, and Jesus did that 3 times. Surely ought to make some kind of mention in some local paper that ought to have been, inscribed someplace, and we ought to have some secular record of him. Well, let me ask you this question in response. For 250 years, we have had Egyptian hieroglyphics, Irish ogham writing, Phoenician coins, Roman pottery, Noah's burial mounds found in West Virginia, Georgia, Michigan, Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Colorado, and I never heard a word about it, and that's in the last 250 years. And now we have the teletype and satellites, and most of you have not heard of those finds. Why in the hell would you expect to hear about Jesus 2,000 years ago, when you haven't heard about Roman pottery in Brazil, discovered, and, by the way, hidden by the Brazilian government because it would embarrass the academic community? In other words, hide the truth for political or religious or economic reasons. That's why you haven't heard about it in secular history, because it has been sanitized. Just like those monuments over here that I mentioned in the last program. I said I was traveling with my wife over here in Illinois, and she said, would you like to see these pyramids? And I said, pyramids? I looked at her like, pyramids? Pyramids in Illinois? Pyramids in Illinois? I almost felt like saying, lady, where is your brain? Pyramids are in Egypt. Pyramids are in Guatemala. Pyramids are in Mexico City. Pyramids in Illinois? And she said, yeah, there's about 7 or 8 here. And I've been to them. I've seen them. She was from Illinois. She knew about them. I said, yeah, let me go look at it. Boys and girls, if you've never heard of these pyramids over here in Illinois, you got to go look at them. It's 400 feet high. It's shaped just like a pyramid in Egypt, and it's 1/2 acre in size at the top of it. I climbed to the top of it. I walked the 400 feet up to the top. It's a state park. I looked at this and I said, now why in the hell haven't I heard about this? I went to public school, and it's because it's sanitized. It does not fit in with the theory of evolution. It doesn't fit in with the political control of the people of America, or indeed the people of the world. Now, religion controls people through their belief system. Governments are doing the same thing. They always have. They don't want you to know anything about your ancient past. That would lead you to the Bible. If you read the Bible and compared that with what we see today, the physical evidence that we see today, you would come to the conclusion that the Grand Canyon came from Noah's flood. Didn't come from evolution. I mean, that's a conclusion that you would arrive at without having been propagandized. And you'd come to that conclusion just by your six senses, your five senses. Women have a sixth sense. You just come to that conclusion based upon reason, logic, and common sense, based upon the facts that are presented. But now, if we could hold the facts back from you, if we could keep certain facts away from you, then we could continue to propagandize you, we could continue to control you. And as we learn more about the Iraq War and the lies that led up with it, you see how the problem the government has in controlling the people and their belief and their support for the war, it is totally eroded. George Bush is totally discredited. Just totally discredited. I wouldn't believe him if he told me he was going to the bathroom. Now, Barry Fell has discovered, not that it wasn't always there, the evidence had been around for 250 years, but he started putting it together, and he formed a group called the Epigraphic Society. It was for the express purpose of putting this information together, putting it in print. It's in the underground press. You're not going to read about this in the New York Times. You won't see this in the major newspapers. You won't read about this in USA Today, and it isn't going to be reported in any of the major colleges or on the news media. But it's available. I mean, the evidence is there, and the pictures are there, and the books are written. I mean, they're not in your college libraries. Which you ought to ask the question, why isn't it in our college library? You're not supposed to know this. That's the bottom line. You're not supposed to know, but I'm going to tell you. Now let's go back here to the epilogue. The cup and ring is a man-made stereotype motif engraved or pecked into rock, and it is composed of a central cup surrounded by one or more concentric rings. Petroglyphs of this type occur in many parts of the Old World as well as in both North and South America and on various oceanic islands. Although their meaning has been discussed since 1859 when Sir J. Gardner Wilkinson drew attention to British examples, no certain conclusions have been reached. Their occasional association with megaliths and stone circles has been held to imply a religious significance, and it has also been suggested that they may have served as markers for early mining activities, since large numbers of examples are known from regions where metallic ores occur, and a calendric use has also been suggested. The example illustrated opposite in the upper illustration was originally found near Canton, Georgia, but has since been removed for safer conservation to the campus of the Reinhardt College in Waleska, Georgia. An article on the American examples written by British authority on the subject, Ronald W. B. Morris, appears in Volume 17, published in 1988, of the Epigraphic Society's occasional publications. The age of American examples cannot as yet be determined, but Morris states that the oldest example in the British Isles is believed to be at New Grange in Ireland, occurring in a megalithic tomb built around 3200 BC. The Reinhardt College example was photographed by Bart B. Henson. Petroglyphs of this kind may be among America's oldest legacies of visits by people from the Old World. Most archaeologists have sought to explain these petroglyphs as merely examples of independent invention. That explanation, if such it is to be termed, cannot apply to the next case, which is illustrated in the lower photograph in the opposite column. Cuneiform tablets of baked clay and of Mesopotamian origin have from time to time turned up in America, and they have been explained as being specimens brought here in modern times by collectors who supposedly then lost them here in America. However, in an article published in Volume 15 of the Epigraphic Society's occasional publications, hereinafter referred to by the acronym ESOP, Dr. Alberto Marini recorded a late Sumerian cuneiform inscription from Bolivia, cut on a stone bowl found near Lake Titicaca. It is a religious invocation addressed to the supreme deity, praying for blessings and guidance in growing grain and herding farm animals. It is associated with archaic Amara hieroglyphic signs incorporating some cuneiform letters, and thus it is a Native American product. It is not an import from abroad. And Dr. Marini holds degrees in Sumeriology, including honorary doctorates from both the U.S. and Latin American institutions, and is at present a professor at John Kennedy University in Buenos Aires. He finds the grammar and vocabulary in the letter forms of the Titicaca inscription to imply a date of about 2000 BC, and he deduces that persons who use the Sumerian language, presumably Sumerians, were present in the Altiplano at the era at that time. This important inscription is now in the Museum de la Paz, where it now may be viewed. Full details of the text appear in the succeeding volumes of the ESOP. The Tai-Pheneg alphabet, shown below, occurs in Bronze Age Norse petroglyphs, where it is used to render Old Norse words, omitting most of the vowels. A related form of Tai-Pheneg, I'm going to call this Tai-Pheneg, is used to this day by some Berber tribes in North Africa, whose ancestors may have acquired it from the Norse raiders in Bronze Age times, when Norse elements may have been included in the general term Sea Peoples. Well-known sites were such Norse inscriptions, or where such Norse inscriptions are those in Bohuslän, Sweden, where fleets of ancient ships are depicted below. In 1954, Canadian field geologists discovered a richly varied petroglyph site near Peterborough, Ontario, in which are featured ancient ships resembling those of the Scandinavian sites, interspersed with human and animal figures with numerous Tai-Pheneg letters between the pictorial elements. It was at first supposed the site had been created by the Algonquin Indian artists, though the local Indian people could throw no light on the subject matter of the carved pictures, and the archaeologists did not recognize the Tai-Pheneg letters. In 1982, in my book Bronze Age America, I deciphered the greater part of the inscriptions and showed that they are written in archaic Norse and relate to a religious, hang on here while I turn the page, a religious center established by Norse traders who were exchanging woven textiles for copper ingots supplied by the Algonquin Indians. The age of the site was estimated to be such as to place it in the Bronze Age, and astronomical details included in the inscription suggest a date for about 1700 BC. At the time, such transatlantic voyages by Scandinavians in Bronze Age vessels were unheard of, and my inferences were ridiculed by the Canadian archaeologists of Ontario. Since then, however, the Danish historian John Galster has examined the site, and his conclusions have been published in book form by the Dansk Historic Society in Copenhagen in 1987. Galster's opinion totally supports my decipherments and conclusions, and he was able to add further details from Scandinavian sites that match and support these inferences. The copper ingot supplied to the Scandinavian traders of the Peterborough site may have resembled the natural ingots shown on page 96, and they probably also included man-made hammered lumps of copper extracted by the ancient miners of Michigan. Some 5,000 abandoned mines have been found on the shores of Lake Superior. Boys and girls, did you hear that? Let me underline it. Some 5,000 abandoned copper mines have been found on the shores of Lake Superior, carbon dated by Professor Roy Dreyer of the Michigan Institute of Mining and Technology to between 2000 BC and 1000 BC, and while it appears that millions of pounds of metallic copper were extracted and cannot now be accounted for, Dreyer and his colleagues surmise that the copper must have been shipped overseas, and now the discovery of the Peterborough site seems to confirm that for Dreyer's account of the matter, see Prehistoric Copper Mining in the Lake Superior Region by Dreyer and Du Temple, published in 1965. Now I'm going to put a bracket around that. As I was educated here in the United States of America, and I never heard a word of it, much less 5,000 ancient copper mines around Lake Superior. I never heard of these petroglyphs here in the United States of America and in southern Canada. Did you, when you went to school? Now, fortunately, when I did finally escape from the institutionalization of the public school system around 1957, I began a study on my own. My run-in with a teacher in high school ran something like this. We called him Shalini Bean. His name was Shalinus. And when we got into the 10th grade, now I was really excited. First day in the 10th grade, I'm in ancient history. And now we're going to start with history. We're going to take a look at history from the Garden of Eden until 1955. That's about when I was in the 10th grade. And I was excited, and I came in and I opened my textbook, and it began with Nebuchadnezzar around, 550 to 580 BC. Now, as young and dumb as I was as a sophomore in high school, I knew that ancient history did not begin with Nebuchadnezzar, that there was time before Nebuchadnezzar. And I thought ancient history meant that you go back to the beginning. Ancient, beginning. It doesn't. And so when we began, I raised my hand in class. Now there's about 30 other kids in here, and I said, but Mr. Shalinus, this book begins, he began class, and he began with Nebuchadnezzar, and I said, but Mr. Shalinus, there was history long before Nebuchadnezzar, and he concurred. He said, yes, that's true. And I said, well, where do we start with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Everybody laughed at me. And he kind of snickered a little bit, and he said, well, we're not going to go back that far. We're going to start with Nebuchadnezzar. And I was really disappointed, and I said, but history doesn't begin with Nebuchadnezzar. And now he got a little sharp with me. He said, Gordon, this textbook begins ancient history with Nebuchadnezzar. This class is beginning ancient history with Nebuchadnezzar. And you are starting your ancient history with Nebuchadnezzar. And that's what reminded me of Galileo. It is true that when you're 15 years old and you're in Mr. Shalinus's class and the textbook begins ancient history with Nebuchadnezzar, and Mr. Shalinus begins ancient history with Nebuchadnezzar, and he announces, and you, Gordon, are beginning ancient history with Nebuchadnezzar. I got the drift of it right away. Ancient history begins with Nebuchadnezzar. But later after class, one of my classmates who was also ridiculing me just exactly like the archaeologists of Ontario ridiculed and impugned this author, Barry Fell. I said to him, nevertheless, it was my friend David Wagner, I said, nevertheless, David, ancient history antedates Nebuchadnezzar. Of which David readily agreed. And that's the kind of intimidation that you young people out there in college run into. You walk into your college class and you raise the subject matter, and your professor is going to put you in your place in damn short order, partner. And you know it, and I know it. So, truth, then, is not the subject matter of higher education. Bottom line. And boys and girls, truth is not the subject matter of politics. Now, truth exists, and truth exists independently of politics and of higher education. I mean, there's truth out there. And the same thing now in nearly everything that we investigate or look at. I don't care whether it's politics, government, public institutions. They all lie to us. They lie to us about economics. If you want to know the truth about the economic circumstances of the United States of America, it's not in the Wall Street Journal. It's in the underground publication. And it's not a very pretty picture, and it's not a picture that your government wants you to know about. And so they hide it, and they lie about it. And the UPS, Reuters, and Associated Press all conspire together to hide it from you. So when you write me a letter and say, but why would they want to do this? Because they want to control you. And they control you, and they control your votes by what you think. Your church controls you by what you believe. Your colleges, your institutions of higher learning, your employers control you by your paychecks and by the academic degrees that they threaten to withhold from you if you don't adhere to the party line. Now, we used to laugh at the communists. If you don't accept and adhere to the political instruction of the Communist Party, you will not get your degree from the University of Petrograd. Just the other day, a guy pointed out to me, he said, at the Smithsonian Institution, they sent a letter out to all of their curators in there concerning a subject matter. I don't remember what the subject matter was, and they said, now, if any of you cannot, in good conscience, subscribe to the official policy of the institution, we would expect your immediate resignation. Now, this is the Smithsonian Institution. This is the highest. This is the apex. This is the crowning glory of intellectual, of museums, of education, of science in the United States of America. It's the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And they plainly told their curators, if you can't subscribe to the official policy, then you can resign. To hell with the truth, you can resign. Now, in the Chicago Museum of Natural History in 1940, they had a skeleton, an ancient skeleton of a man, 14 feet tall, which corroborates the biblical story that in the ancient times there were giants in the earth in those days. That skeleton is gone today. I have a picture of it here. That skeleton is gone. It was there in 1940. Or 39, maybe it was in 40 that it disappeared. But it was there in the 30s, and in 1940 it disappears from the textbooks. It just disappears. Where it is today, I don't know. But it doesn't fit the theory of evolution. It doesn't fit the political and the scientific dogma of our time. And so therefore we remove it. And that's what Berryfell is revealing in America, BC. That the colleges and universities, when this evidence is brought to light, they bury it, they ridicule it, they impugn it, they make fun of it, and then they threaten you. And they say, if you can't accept Columbus as being the first person to discover America, or the discoverer of America, we would expect your resignation. Boys and girls, that's not science. That is not honest. It's not even academic. It is pure, unadulterated propaganda. Nothing more, nothing less. And we've all been taught to believe it. Now, I'm one of those that believed it. I mean, I went to public school just like everybody else, and I believed what they taught me. I didn't see any reason why Mr. Shalinas would want to lie to me, but he did. I couldn't see any reason why Mrs. Lowry would lie to me, but she did. And I couldn't see any reason why President Roosevelt would lie to me, but he did. And over the years, I have discovered that our society here in the United States, now I can't speak for you people in Canada and Australia, I don't know. Maybe you people got the straight truth. Maybe you got the straight skinny from your teachers. But let me tell you, not here in the United States of America, not in the public school system in Eureka, California, or Ferndale, or Arcata, or Fortuna. They all lied to us. And the textbooks lied to us. And that's why textbooks have to be replaced constantly. Textbooks on science are constantly replaced. Not the Bible. The Bible and its pronouncements on science are always the same. They've been that way for 3,000 years, and every time we test them, they're always true, they're always accurate, and they're always correct. Not so the science textbooks. Not so the textbooks of the Middle Ages that told us that the world was flat, when the Bible tells us it was round. That's right. Twice in the Scripture, the configuration of the world is described as being round. Just thought I'd point that out to you. But it didn't fit with Catholic theology. and because it didn't fit with the theology of the time, it had to be banned. And anybody who would dare to say that the world was round was branded as a heretic, and that's what happened here to Barry Fell and Gloria Farley. They were branded as heretics, archaeological heretics. Fortunately, though, over time, as is always the inevitable outcome, the truth eventually, little by little, comes to light. And then people like Galileo and Barry Fell and Gloria Farley are vindicated long after they're dead and buried. I mean, they personally have always been ridiculed and impugned. But after they're dead, then those of us, who slowly but surely discover the truth and publish it, and the Johnny-come-latelys, like yours truly here, George Gordon is a Johnny-come-lately. I come along and say, wow, look at these guys. They knew the truth long before the officials at the Smithsonian Institution and the President of the United States and the scientists and the archaeologists of academia today. Well, in 1977, Professor Gad Rusing suggested that Scandinavian Bronze Age voyages may have occurred, his evidence being the bronze axe shown on this page and now located in the Museum of the American Indian, New York. Scientifically, or significantly, the axe was found in Ontario. So here's a Bronze Age axe. Nothing like it ever discovered among the American Indians before or since. But here it is, and it's found in Ontario, Canada. It's sitting in a museum in New York. How come we never heard about that? Here's Barry Fell standing next to the famous Los Lunas inscription on Hidden Mountain, New Mexico, lower left, Fell, who reported in 1985 on the punctuation. This is a big rock. I mean, he's standing next to the rock. I'll describe it for you here. And this rock is probably 3 times bigger than Mr. Fell. He's got his hand upon it. Lengthways, it's probably 6 feet. And sideways, that is the narrow direction, it's probably 3. It's a stone about 3 by 6 feet. Looking at it here, it's probably 12 to 16 inches thick. This rock is so big that it probably weighs 10 tons. 10 tons. And he's standing below it, and where it's located, from where he's standing, it's over his head his head's about 6-8 inches up from the bottom. He's got his hand on it. This is called this remarkable version of the Hebrew Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments, located on Hidden Mountain near Albuquerque, New Mexico, became the main focus of attention during the Epigraphic Congress, sponsored by the Western chapter of the Epigraphic Society in 1984. The inscription, written in ancient Hebrew letters of the style of the Moab stone about 1000 BC, was not translated until 1949, when Professor Robert Pfeiffer of Harvard University recognized it as a short version of the Ten Commandments as given in the 20th chapter of Exodus. For long it was thought to be a modern engraving until the examination carried out in 1984 disclosed anomalous features that may imply an antiquity. The geologist George E. Morehouse, reporting in ESOP, that's the Epigraphic Society Occasional Publication, Volume 13, published in 1985, found patina indicative of an age from 500 to 2,000 years, and Fell, reporting in the same volume, noted that the punctuation matched that of ancient Greek manuscripts such as the Codex Sinaiticus of the 4th century AD. All right, hang on a second, boys and girls. Let's pause here for a moment in our closing minute or two. The Ten Commandments are found in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They've been there for at least 2,500 to 3,500 years. How in the hell did the Ten Commandments get there? And why weren't you told about it? Because it doesn't fit with evolution, but it certainly fits with the Scriptures. We don't want you to believe in the Bible, the Ten Commandments, or God, or special creation. We want you to believe in the Republican Party, in the Democratic Party. We want you to believe in science, archaeology, politics, and Columbus. For you to know that in New Mexico, the Ten Commandments are found written in Hebrew 2,500 years ago doesn't fit. And you're not supposed to know that. So we hide it. I say that is intellectual dishonesty. That is pure propaganda.
The subject of America BC sounds like an oxymoron. When we talk about BC, that's the old term, that said before Christ. And so when I went to school, we used to use BC and AD, and they would take us back to BC, that nebulous period of ancient history before Christ. Now, Christ came along about 2,000 years ago, so when we go back before 2,000 years, we're talking about going back some in time. Now, from Christ forward, we have a pretty good history, at least we think we do. We talk about the Roman Empire, and then we talk about the Middle Ages, and then we talk about the colonial period, and then we get up to the modern era. And we go to school and we learn about these historical facts. Remember, I can remember learning about Constantine and the founding of Christianity and the Roman Empire, and then knowledge fell off a cliff sometime after the Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, and didn't recover until the Renaissance period of around 12 to 1700, about a 500-year period there from 1200 to about 700, called the Middle Ages, in which these great cathedrals and great knowledge in Isaac Newton and Galileo and Leonardo da Vinci and these great thinkers, came along and revived knowledge which somehow had been lost after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And then we enter the modern era. This is right after the colonial period. The industrial age, about 1800, took over in Europe, primarily in England, and has now ushered in the modern technological era. What would you think if you had a technological era like we have today before Noah's flood? What would you think of that? Why, it sounds preposterous. Sounds insane. And yet I mentioned to you in the last program that Columbus, just 500 years ago, without any metallurgy at all, were casting iron to make cannon in sand, which is about as primitive as you can get. No blast furnaces, no modern technology, no turret lathes, no lathes at all, and no metalworking at all. Now, there was some iron work, taking raw iron or metals and copper and so on, and beating them on a rock or beating them on an anvil to make a knife. Boys and girls, that's not metallurgy. Metallurgy is when you combine metals and you come up with steel. Now we're talking about metallurgy. Now, we've done that in 500 years. The time frame between Adam and Eve and the flood was 1,656 years. And in 1,600 years, right at the very beginning, they were artificers in brass and iron. I brought that out to you last time. Now, that has very important implications, especially when you combine that with another statement that's made over here in Genesis chapter 11, where God said at the Tower of Babel, when he came down, he took a look at the Tower of Babel, and he said, now look what they begin to do. And he said, and now nothing will be restrained from them or withheld from them. Now that was quite a prophecy. This is the creator of the universe. He's taking a look now at men after the flood. At a place called the Tower of Babel, he said in verse 4, go to, let us build us a city and tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Eternal came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Eternal said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Quite a statement. Now take a look at where we are today. But it's a long time between the Tower of Babel, which occurred around 2200 2300 BC. And today, 2007, as I speak, AD, we're talking about 4,000 plus years to get to where we are today. Now, when Barry Fell started looking at these monuments, these Ogham writings, he discovered that these were made not by the local Indians, not by the American Indians, but by somebody else. And of course the question arises, well, who was this somebody else? Where did these people come from? Now, this is where superstition came into the picture. Remember that the Catholic Church, which held sway over the minds of men during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had come up with some pronouncements that I'm sure that they all believed came from the Bible, and they all believed were true, accurate, and correct, which later we found were not. And we have the same superstition going on today in our educational institutions and our political establishments. If you don't adhere to the party line, and I mentioned this to you last time, the prestigious Smithsonian Institution, which is funded by your tax dollars and probably is the biggest collection or has the biggest collection of just about everything that there is in the world, said to their staff that if you can't adhere to our policies, then you need to resign. So much for freedom of speech or freedom of thought. Did it ever occur to us that maybe we don't have 100% of the truth today? And that maybe somebody else will come along 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now, and they will have clearer information, better facts, that's going to shed more light on a particular subject, and that maybe we're going to have to reevaluate our thinking in the future as it related to the past. Now, if you take a look at science textbooks of 100 years ago, they're so far out of date, and they're so filled with superstition and false doctrine and misguided facts that they're a laughingstock, absolute laughingstock. In fact, you won't even find science textbooks from the 1930s being used in your colleges and universities today. That's how recently that science had to be revised. Just the science of the 1920s and 30s and 40s had to be revised because it was false. But they don't come out and tell us, well, what we learned some 10, 20, 30 years ago is false. They never make that admission. They're kind of like President Bush. He never admits, I made a mistake or I'm wrong. We can all figure that out after the fact. But he never comes forward, and neither does science or technology come forward and say, hey, we were wrong about this, and so we're going to make this correction. And so let's delete this, and then for all of you people that believe this, let's take a little piece of history. In 1915, a ship called the Lusitania sailed from New York, and it was loaded with contraband from the United States bound for Great Britain. Now, the Germans knew that this ship had contraband on it, and America, claiming to be neutral, said, no, we're not doing anything like that. We're not making arms, or we're not shipping arms and ammunition from the United States to Great Britain. So the Germans, through their intelligence apparatus, figured it out, and so they took out 5 ads in 5 big American newspapers and said, now listen, you Americans over there, butt out of our war over here in Europe, and if we catch this ship, and they identified the ship, they said, if we catch this ship on the high seas, we're going to sink it. So don't get on it. It's dangerous. Americans didn't pay any attention, of course, because we believed our President Wilson at that time, would tell us the truth. Politicians lie to us constantly and continuously. Wilson was a liar. He said that we're not shipping any contraband, any war material to the British. He knew better. In fact, we found out later that this is now in 1967, 50 years later. Not only were we shipping arms and munitions to the British on these merchant ships, we had a manufacturing plant in Indianapolis, Indiana, that was turning out war material, especially ammunition for British caliber guns. So it wasn't that they were buying .30-06 ammunition and then buying .30-06 rifles and then shipping them over there. No. We had tooled up in this country, in our munitions factories, to turn out the munitions that would fit the British guns. loaded it on British ships in New York clandestinely, and then shipped it over to them. It's been going on now for a couple of years. So the British in 1915 were hauling this stuff from the United States over to Great Britain. It makes all the sense in the world for them. And it makes all the sense in the world for the Germans to sink it. Now, my granddad believed President Wilson, and he instructed me, little Georgie Gordon, he said, those dirty Huns sank an unarmed merchant vessel. And that's one of the things that propelled America to get into the war on the British side. Now, the truth of the matter is, the Germans were correct. The British and the Americans were conspiring together to violate the law. We did, and we see that in Iraq and Afghanistan today, and after the fact, we can put those numbers together. And we can come to a conclusion. Our government lies to us from time to time. Now, I showed you last time we were talking about the epilogue out of the book, which is called America BC, written by Barry Fell. His name is F-E-L-L. It's easy enough. Barry, B-A-R-R-Y. America BC. And it talks about the ancient settlers in the New World. In the epilogue, I brought you up to speed last time, and I showed you a couple of 3 examples of, for instance, the 10 Commandments written in Hebrew. This is called the famous Los Lunas inscription on Hidden Mountain, New Mexico, Fell, who reported in 1985 on the punctuation. Now, when did you ever hear in your high school class about ancient history, about the 10 Commandments being found down near Albuquerque, New Mexico? I never did. I went to public school. Now, here's another example. Hebrew inscription at Bat Creek, Tennessee, now dated by radiocarbon to the Middle Woodland period, about 1605 BC. Here's yet another example. Roman amphora. These are Roman vases of the 3rd century AD, brought up from the seabed at Guanabara Bay, Brazil. Now, what in the world are these ancient Roman vases doing over in Brazil from the 3rd century? Now, you don't have to be real smart to figure out that. Let's see. If we were to find Roman vases submerged in a bay in Brazil that date back to the 3rd century, well, then wouldn't it tell you that Romans must have visited there in the 3rd century? I mean, just all things being equal. Here's another example. Coins. Roman coins believed to have been washed ashore from a vessel thought to have sunk around 375 AD off the coast of Beverly, Massachusetts. Beverly, Massachusetts. 375 AD off the coast of Beverly, Massachusetts. These Romans are traveling from Brazil to Massachusetts in the 3rd century. This is the period of Constantine. Do you remember when you went to catechism and they told you about Constantine, the great Christian, who changed the Sabbath, from Saturday to Sunday? Yeah, that's about the period of time during the Roman Empire. And here we find shipwrecks and Roman coins in America from Brazil to Massachusetts. And there's more. Here's another one. Ogham writing all over the United States. Some 3,000 sites of this Ogham writing, which is a form of writing that comes from the British Isles and is found up and down the Mississippi River, up and down the Arkansas, Cimarron rivers, all the way over to Denver, Colorado. From Denver, Colorado to New Orleans, there are sites everywhere where this Ogham writing appears. Here's another one. Opposite the Viking Church Tower at Newport, Rhode Island. Now, you people here, this is quite a little thing. This has got an iron fence around it. It's in Newport, Rhode Island. It's a Viking church tower at Newport, Rhode Island, and although observed and mapped by the Italian navigator Giovanni Verrazzano in 1524, modern tradition mistakenly attributes it to Governor Benedict Arnold. Below, a portion of the inscription in Norse ruins on the so-called Kensington Stone of Minnesota. It reports the misadventures of a party of Norse explorers in the year 1362. Recent studies by Dr. Richard Nielsen completely vindicate the authenticity of this historic document and dispel charges of fraud raised by earlier writers. Now that's just the tip of the iceberg from the epilogue of the book America, BC. You people up there in New England are sitting on one of the richest sources of archaeological finds of settlers and explorers who have come to the Americas over the last 3,000 years. We are simply the last group that have found America. America has been found and lost numerous times by ancient peoples. Now, this is a fascinating question. Why was it lost? If they found it in the age of Solomon, let's say, well then what happened that cut off the old world from the new world? Did something dramatic occur? Well, you bet it did, and it's revealed in the pages of the Bible. It was the destruction of the Celtic people in the Middle East. When God destroyed Israel in 718 BC, the people over here in the Western world got cut off from the Eastern world, and they were cut off for thousands of years. Well, maybe not thousands, but at least for hundreds of years, and then they were refound in the Carthaginian period. And then they were lost again during the Roman period, and then the Romans and the Egyptians came over and refound it. And the reason that we have pyramids here in the New World that look like the pyramids of Egypt is because the Egyptians were here. And the reason that we have these place names up in New England is because the Celts were here. Now, isn't that just real special? All right, let me suggest to you that we take a look here at the Egyptian presence on page 253. The Egyptians here in the New World. This chapter sets out newly recognized evidence showing clearly that ancient Egyptians once visited North America, and while here, they imparted a detailed knowledge of their complicated hieroglyphic writing to the people who lived in Canada and the United States at that time. The evidence is extraordinarily rich in variety and amount, and perhaps one of the more surprising things is that no one until now seems to have noticed it. Pause. Let me put my famous mark in the margin. I went down to Mexico City when I was a kid back in 1958, 960, along in there. Made 2 or 3 trips. And I went out to the Pyramid of the Sun. And when I got out there and I looked at that mountain, I mean, it's a mountain of cut rock. Now, I haven't been to Egypt, and I haven't seen the Great Pyramid eyeball to eyeball, but I've seen the pictures of it. And I remember as a kid, I was probably 19, 20, 21 years old, and I looked at that and I said, wait a minute. How in the hell can you build a pyramid like that one right there I'm looking at in Mexico City, unless you had seen one of those once before? Now, I told you about these pyramids over here in Illinois. Now, they're not made out of cut rock. They're made out of dirt. Now, I don't know how many people it takes to build a mountain. Now, these mountains, these pyramids, they cover many acres of ground. The base of these pyramids, the Great Pyramid of Egypt, which is the biggest, covers 14 acres. 14 acres at the base. So when I read Fell's book, and Fell corroborated for me, my gut reaction was, my common sense said to me, these people have had contact with the Egyptians. Fell comes along, writes a book, and he says, yep, that's right, the Egyptians were here in the New World. Now, I don't know whether the Egyptians built that pyramid down there, or whether the Indians built it, or like Columbus. Now, Columbus took a bunch of Indians from America back to Europe. Did those Indians that he took to Europe come back to the New World? I suppose they did. Or some of them did. And when they did they bring back any European customs or ideas with them? And vice versa. I mean, there's a lot of things that Columbus learned over here in the New World and then took back to the Old World, like corn and tobacco.
Now, my opportunity, this is Barry Feldman, I says, my opportunity to study it came about mainly through sleuthing by John Williams. After the ground froze in New England, John began a lengthy search of the documents stored in the great Widner Library of Harvard College. And he was seeking out references in earlier reports of excavations that might lead us to find new sites to explore, or to museums where material of significance to our studies might be stored. In the course of this inquiry, he consulted works in the Indian languages. One day, John brought me a copy of a curious document printed in New York in 1866, and it included in a book on the Wabanaki Indians of Maine, written by Eugene Vitromile, a priest who ministered to those Indians. This document comprised a single sheet. It was headed The Lord's Prayer in Macmic Hieroglyphics. At first glance, I perceived that about half, at least, of the hieroglyphic signs were remarkably similar to Egyptian hieroglyphics, as rendered in the simple cursive form called hieractic, spelled H-I-E-R-A-T-I-C. But what was more surprising to me, indeed mystifying, was that the meanings of these signs in Egyptian matched the meaning assigned to them in the English translation of the Micmac text which was given on the document. Now, let me put my famous mark here. Think about this. Here's a piece of paper that is written in 1866 by a missionary. This missionary is up here talking to the Micmac Indians in Maine, 1866. And he translates the Lord's Prayer out of English into the Micmac language. And in the Micmac language, he uses their signs. I'm sure this guy must have known that these were Egyptian hieroglyphics. But he may not have. Maybe he didn't. But he knew the Micmac language. He'd been among them. He'd been ministering to them. And he knew what their hieroglyphic signs were, say, for a fish, or for a dog, or for a turtle, or something else. And so he translates the Lord's Prayer out of English for the Micmac into these Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, my gut reaction says, well, he probably knew Egyptian hieroglyphics. And that's probably why he put a copy of it into a museum. He saved a copy of it, or if he didn't, somebody else did. Now, here it is in the Harvard. It's buried in the Harvard Library. And this professor comes along. He discovers what he sees as Egyptian hieroglyphics in Maine among the Micmac Indians. Now, hey, kids, wait a minute. Hang on a second. One of two things here. Either one, the Micmacs independently, accidentally, just by caprice, just happened to use the same symbols to describe fish, turtles, dogs, etc. as the Egyptians. Or else the Micmacs must have gone to Egypt and picked it up, or the Egyptians came to Maine and left it behind. Now, what do you think? You know, just being a farm kid and all, if I read a story like this, I say, oh, okay. Kind of like when I was a kid, I'm down here looking at this big pyramid, and I said, wow. I mean, you've got to actually stand down there at the bottom of it and look at it to say, wow. When you see a picture, it does not convey to your mind the immensity, the complexity of that pyramid, the work, the labor, the engineering that went into that. And the same thing is true with these dirt pyramids up here in Illinois. They're nothing to sneeze at. They are monsters. They are huge. You've got to actually look at that thing, stand at the bottom of it to appreciate it. Now, it may be made out of dirt, but how many basketfuls of dirt did those Indians carry from someplace out there and pile it up? Where did the dirt come from? It's not excavated anywhere close by. Or if it was, it's all been filled in again. I mean, we're talking about mountains. We're talking about 10 or 15 acres of land at the base, 400 feet high with 1/2 acre on the top of it. Now that's the size of the pyramid that I walked up to in Illinois. I walked up to the top of it. Now when you see something like this and you muse, you say, wow, these Indians, they weren't as dumb as we give them credit for. You know, we Americans today aren't building pyramids like that. Now these people had technology. These people had an ability. And they tell us. Now when I went to school, when we were talking about the Great Pyramid, they told us that in order to level that thing up, and it's perfectly level, the Great Pyramid is perfectly level, sitting on bedrock. And I was told in the 10th grade that in order to do that, they sewed goat intestines together to make a water level, which is common. You can take a hose, fill it with water, and 50, 100 feet, and you can level from 50 to 100 feet through that hose with a water level. I don't deny that. I don't deny it. But I've never seen anybody do that over 14 acres, which is nearly a quarter of a mile. And that's the way they said that they leveled up the Great Pyramid. Leveled it up. And then they squared it up. Squared it up. And in 1964, there was some outfit, I don't know if it was Bechtel or somebody, went over there with a laser transit and measured that thing up, and it's plus or minus 1/2 inch over 14 acres, which is a quarter of a mile from one corner to the next. And they did it with a laser transit, and it wasn't until 1964 that they were able to measure the accuracy of that building, which, by the way, has expansion and contraction grooves cut into the base so that when the sun heats it, and typically on one side, heats it on one side, it will expand through those expansion grooves so that it doesn't break the stone. Now, you're going to tell me that these people built that with goat guts? You know, I'm an old-timey general contractor, kids. I'm living in a house 40 by 50 feet, 40 feet long, or 50 feet long, 40 feet wide. I put a roof on it here some years back. And naturally, in the process of putting the roof on, this house, which is very, very well built, is 2 inches out of square, and it's 40 by 50. And this Great Pyramid now is plus or minus 1/2 inch. Plus or minus 1/2 inch. My house is plus or minus 2 inches. Actually, it's plus or minus 1 inch on 2 corners, which equals 2 inches out of square. But, you know, when we put the roof on it, it's longer at the top by 1 inch and longer at the bottom on the opposite end by 1 inch. It's not exactly square. And it's only 40 by 50 feet, and it's accepted, you know, construction. I don't think anybody can complain about this house being out by 1 inch. But it's not covering 14 acres. It's not a quarter of a mile from corner to corner. And it's not accurate to within 1/2 inch. Now, I don't know about the Pyramid of the Sun down in Mexico City. I haven't seen any numbers on that. But boys and girls, here's the bottom line. These ancient people were not dumb, and they weren't dragging their knuckles on the ground like we've been taught in our public schools about how man is getting smarter and smarter and evolving and developing. Boys and girls, we had technology and we lost it, and we're just now getting it back. I would venture a guess and say that technology today still has not reached the level of technology prior to Noah's flood. We're not there yet. And now the Egyptian presence here in the New World puts an entirely new wrinkle. It wasn't just the Celts, but the Romans were also here. We have evidence now of the Egyptians being over here. In the same way that the Japanese are in Europe. Japanese ships travel to Europe. Japanese ships travel to South America. Japanese ships travel to Canada. Japanese ships travel to America. Japanese ships, boys and girls, travel to every country in the world. American ships travel to every country in the world. German ships travel to every country in the world. There was worldwide commerce in the days of Solomon. Now there's more to be shed on that story by Stephen Collins, who wrote 5 books. The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel Found was his first book. Quite a story. I'll tell you more about Collins, and we'll pick this up next time on the Egyptian presence. America, BC, Barry Fell. It will open your eyeballs to the lies, the hypocrisy, and the deception that's going on in our educational institutions today, and expose for you in broad daylight the lying chicanery that's been going on from the time you were in the first grade. I was watching the Lair News Hour last night, and had a segment on there concerning our public schools. And they said, our public schools are failing us. And in the segment, they said, we've got to spend more money, and we've got to lower our class size. The reading and the math, the test scores are below the national average, and it's just really bad. And we're talking about the District of Columbia schools, the inner city schools. And I looked at that and I said, where have I heard that story before? Now think about this. Just think now. All of your life, test scores have been going down, and the solution to Johnny can't read is more money and lower class size. Isn't it? Is there any other solution? Lower class size, more money, and everybody's kind of chomping at the bits. And oh God, what are we going to do? Now let me tell you a little story. I went to the public school system back in the 1940s. Johnny could read, Johnny could write, and Johnny could add and subtract. We didn't have any problems. And when we got through at the end of the day, say 3rd grade, Mrs. Wiles, and we got through at the end of the day, at the end of the class year, every child, 32 of them in that class, this lady was about 62 when I was in the 3rd grade. She was 62 years old. Jenny Wiles was her name, an old lady. And she ruled the class with an iron hand. That was number 1. There was discipline in the class, and that was yes ma'am and no ma'am. Number 1. She divided the class into 3 groups, smart, ordinary, and dumb. And she taught to the highest common denominator, the smartest kids in the class. And everybody was trying to emulate, everybody was trying to get to the top of the class. Today, we teach to the bottom of the class. We hold everybody that's smart back to the least common denominator, which is the dumbest kid. Now, we practice the 10 planks to the Communist Manifesto. The 10th plank calls for free education for all children in public schools. When I went to public school, it was a bad educational system. And it has gotten worse from 1947 to 2007, and from 2007 to 2047, it will get even worse. It will never get better. It will only get worse. It will only degenerate. So if you want your children to go to public school, have at it. You're in the majority. But don't wring your hands and wonder why Johnny can't read, can't write, and can't spell. Communism has never worked anywhere in the world where it has been tried. We Americans are now implementing the 10 planks to the Communist Manifesto. They tried it in China, it didn't work. They tried it in Russia, and it didn't work. They abandoned it and went to the free market system and got onto something a little better. It's working. We Americans will go the way of the communists that have preceded us. We will totally fail and be taken into national captivity. That's the bottom line. Now, that I've given you the bad news, the purpose behind that is the reason that we don't know about America, BC, is because we went to public school and we were lied to, pure and simple. And that's one of the tenets of communism. You lie to people for the purposes of people control. But communism isn't anything new. Whether it's Catholicism or communism or capitalism or fascism or socialism, just hang an ism out there, and it's got a least common denominator, and that is people control. That's the bottom line. It always has been. For thousands of years past, it is now and always will be thousands of years into the future if time goes on with man in control. Now, fortunately, there's a God out there in heaven someplace, and he said, I'm going to come back and straighten that mess out. And when I do, there's going to be weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. Now, meanwhile, back on the farm, for us down here on planet Earth, God isn't here yet. We still have this people control mentality, and we're practicing communism here in the United States, Canada, and Australia, Western Europe. And we think that we're really smart and up to date and chic and just right on top of everything. until we pick up America BC and find out, hey, we're not nearly as knowledgeable, not nearly as smart as we thought we were. Now, when we broke off last time, I was telling you that there was an Egyptian presence here in the New World. And the Egyptian presence was very plain up in Maine with a group of people called the Micmac Indians. And we discovered, and this has been around since 1866, a document up there that a fellow who was a missionary up to the Micmacs had translated from the English into the Micmac language, and come to find out the Micmacs are using Egyptian hieroglyphics. Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, where in the hell did the Micmac Indians learn about Egyptian hieroglyphics? Did the Micmacs go to Egypt? Did the Egyptians come to Maine? You know, something happened there, didn't it? You know, if you haven't been to college and you haven't had your mind totally shut off, something happened, didn't it? And now we find out from America BC that we've been lied to by our academic institutions. And it's done for mind control, because the opposite to evolution is special creation. And if we were created by a divine being, I'm going to presume that he was a little smarter than the creation that he made. My common sense says that the man who creates the computer is smarter than the computer. The God that created the man is probably a little smarter than the man that he created. Now, the man that he created was pretty smart in ancient times, because he could build pyramids with expansion joints to plus or minus a half an inch. That's pretty technologically advanced. He could make stone of irregular shapes, of gigantic weights like 50 tons, and then make other stones of irregular shapes, match with them to within plus or minus 50 thousandths of an inch, which, you know, in machine terminology isn't very close, but for stonework it's real close. Real close. And we can't duplicate that technology today. We cannot make those kinds of rock cuts with that kind of precision and accuracy. Now, boys and girls, whoever was doing that, building Stonehenge, building these monuments, building these pyramids, were not sewing goat guts together to make them. If you had to have a laser transit to measure the damn thing, you had to have at least a laser transit to build it. Where on earth are our minds, kids? You know, if we were going to fly to the moon and we were going to say, well, we designed this space rocket and we were using goat guts to level up the launch pad over here, you'd think that somebody that made such a statement was insane, wouldn't you? And rightly so. Nobody's flying rockets to the moon by leveling up the launch pad by sewing goat guts together. And nobody built the Great Pyramid sewing goat guts. You know, I say it's time to take a look at these educators over here that have been lying to us for all these years and start educating ourselves. You're not going to educate yourself in public school. That's the place where you got dumbed down to start with. That was the problem. Now, I went to school in the 1940s. I wasn't dumbed up. I was dumbed down. I wasn't, when I got out of the program, the institution. I was institutionalized for 12 years. After my institutionalization, I wasn't smarter than the previous generation. I was dumber than my father, who was dumber than his father, who was dumber than his father. We've been in a process of dumbing down, not building up. That's the bottom line.